December 17, 1939. The North Atlantic, 240 miles west of the Hebrides. Lieutenant Commander Edward Bayldon stood on the bridge of HMS Walker as freezing spray lashed across the wheelhouse windows, watching the sonar operator's hand freeze mid-motion over his equipment. "Contact," the young rating whispered, his voice cracking. "Bearing 045, range 800 yards." The destroyer's ancient hull shuddered as her boilers, installed in 1918, pushed her through 12-foot swells. Walker was a V-class destroyer, a leftover from the last war, her triple expansion engines designed when submarines could barely submerge for hours, and wireless telegraphy was cutting-edge technology. The Admiralty had already written her off. Too slow for fleet actions, too old for modern convoy work. Her depth charges were hand-rolled off stern racks like barrels, and her sonar, if you could call it that, was barely more sophisticated than listening through a drainpipe. Bayldon's knuckles whitened on the bridge rail as the sonar ping echoed back, solid and unmistakable. Somewhere beneath those black waves, a U-boat commander was calculating firing solutions, his torpedoes already flooding their tubes. Walker had one advantage her designers never intended, one tactical option that existed purely because she was built in an era when ramming was still considered a legitimate naval tactic. What would happen in the next 11 minutes would force the Kriegsmarine to issue emergency tactical bulletins. It would validate a doctrine the Royal Navy thought it had abandoned in 1918. And it would prove that in the brutal mathematics of anti-submarine warfare, sometimes the oldest weapon is the one your enemy least expects. For 4 months, the Battle of the Atlantic had been exposing a terrifying truth. Britain's destroyer fleet was catastrophically unprepared for modern submarine warfare. When war was declared in September 1939, the Royal Navy possessed 113 destroyers designated for convoy escort duties. 38 of them were V and W class vessels built between 1917 and 1918, ships designed to hunt submarines that cruised at 8 knots submerged and could dive to perhaps 200 feet before their pressure hulls buckled. Admiral Karl Dunitz's Type 7 U-boats were an entirely different proposition. They could reach 17 knots submerged in short bursts, dive to 750 feet, and remain underwater for 2 hours on battery power. Their acoustic sensors could detect propeller cavitation at 3 miles. Their captains were trained in wolfpack tactics that British anti-submarine doctrine hadn't even theorized yet. By December 1939, German submarines had sunk 114 merchant vessels, totaling 421,156 tons. The rate was accelerating. The V-class destroyers attempting to counter this threat were armed with a single QF 4-inch MKV gun forward, perhaps 30 depth charges stored in racks, and Type 123A sonar with an effective range of 1,500 yards under perfect. Conditions that never existed in the North Atlantic. Their top speed of 34 knots, impressive in 1918, was barely adequate for 1939. Most critically, their depth charges had to be manually rolled off the stern, creating a predictable attack pattern any competent U-boat commander could evade by simply diving deep and turning hard the moment he heard screws passing overhead. Commander Donald McIntyre, who would later become one of Britain's most decorated escort group commanders, described the early war period bluntly in his after-action reports. "We were hunting modern predators with museum pieces. The U-boats could hear us coming from miles away, dive beneath our sonar's effective depth, and surface behind us before we could even turn around. It wasn't combat, it was a shooting gallery, and we were the targets." The statistics backed up the terror. In November 1939, German submarines achieved a kill ratio of 7.3 merchant ships per U-boat lost. British destroyers were making an average of 42 depth charge attacks per confirmed U-boat kill. The mathematics were unsustainable. At current loss rates, Britain would lose the Atlantic convoy system, and with it, any hope of continuing the war within 18 months. What made the situation particularly devastating was that British naval architects understood the problem perfectly. They knew the V-class hulls were obsolete. They knew the sonar was inadequate. They knew the depth charge tactics were predictable. But building new destroyers took 2 years, and Britain didn't have 2 years. The Fleet Destroyer Construction Program had been prioritized for fleet actions against surface raiders, not convoy escort. The Admiralty's response was to issue tactical bulletins emphasizing aggressive prosecution of sonar contacts and close coordination with aircraft support. Neither tactic addressed the fundamental problem. When a World War I destroyer encountered a modern submarine, the submarine dictated the terms of engagement. It could dive deeper than the destroyer's weapons could reach. It could outrun the destroyer underwater. It could hear the destroyer coming long before the destroyer's sonar could acquire a firing solution. For the aging V-class destroyers, the tactical situation was approaching hopeless. Their crews took to calling them rust buckets and Kaiser's Revenge, ships so obsolete that even sinking them would be doing the Royal Navy a favor. The Admiralty was already quietly discussing decommissioning the entire class and converting them to fast troop transports or depot ships. Then came December 17, 1939, and HMS Walker, and a U-boat commander who was about to learn that the most dangerous weapons are the ones you've convinced yourself no longer exist. Kapitän Leutnant Klaus Everth commanded U-55 with the confidence of a man who understood he possessed overwhelming tactical superiority. His Type 7B submarine displaced 753 tons submerged, carried 14 torpedoes, and could crash dive to periscope depth in 25 seconds. His crew had completed their training in the Baltic and spent 2 months hunting in the western approaches with textbook efficiency. They'd sunk 4 merchantmen totaling 18,000 tons without a single depth charge coming within lethal range. When U-55's hydrophone operator reported propeller signatures bearing 315 degrees, Everth's reaction was almost casual. The acoustic signature was distinctive: triple expansion engines, single shaft, the laboring rhythm of an overloaded steam plant, a V-class destroyer, possibly a W-class. Either way, a relic from the previous war that posed minimal threat to a properly handled submarine. Kriegsmarine tactical doctrine for engaging old British destroyers was straightforward: submerge to 400 feet, well below the effective detonation depth of British depth charges. Listen as the destroyer made its sonar run overhead. Wait for the depth charges to detonate harmlessly 150 feet above. Surface after the destroyer had moved on. Recharge batteries. Continue hunting. German submarine commanders called it riding out the storm. Some referred to the older British destroyers as Übungsziele, training targets. What Everth and his fellow U-boat commanders didn't realize was that their contempt for British destroyer capabilities was creating a critical blind spot. The German tactical manual, Handbuch für U-Boot-Kommandanten, devoted 43 pages to evading modern destroyers with head-throwing weapons and coordinated attacks. It devoted exactly 2 paragraphs to V-class destroyers, basically advising commanders to dive deep and wait them out. The manual made no mention of ramming. Why would it? Naval ramming tactics had been effectively obsolete since 1918, rendered impractical by modern ship speeds, torpedo ranges, and the simple fact that ramming an enemy vessel usually damaged your own ship as badly as it damaged the target. The last recorded successful ramming in naval warfare had occurred in 1914 when HMS Dreadnought sank U-29. That was 25 years ago. An entire generation of naval officers had been trained to consider ramming a desperation tactic of last resort. something you did when all weapons were exhausted and capture was imminent. British tactical bulletins had reinforced this thinking. Admiralty Fleet Order 233739, issued in October, explicitly discouraged ramming attempts against submerged submarines. Depth charge attacks offer superior probability of success with reduced risk to friendly vessels. Commanders are reminded that destroyer hulls cannot sustain impact damage without compromising operational availability. Even among Walker's own crew, the idea of intentionally ramming a submarine would have seemed reckless to the point of suicidal. Destroyer hulls were thin-plated steel designed for speed, not collision. Striking a submarine's pressure hull could tear open Walker's own bow compartments, flood her forward magazine, or snap her keel. She might sink faster than her target. Ewirth had every reason to be confident as he ordered U-55 down to 420 feet and reduced to silent running. The old British destroyer overhead was following a predictable attack pattern. This would be routine. He couldn't have been more wrong. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the early anti-submarine warfare of World War II. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about HMS Walker's ramming attack before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the desperate early days of the Battle of the Atlantic, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right. Tracking down Admiralty records and U-boat war diaries isn't easy, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Lieutenant Commander Bayldon had fought submarines in these same waters 21 years earlier. He'd been a junior officer aboard HMS Vanquisher in 1918 when ramming was still doctrine, when submarines were slow enough and fragile enough that a well-executed collision could crush their conning towers and send them straight to the bottom. The tactic had fallen out of favor, not because it didn't work, but because submarines had become too fast and too deep for surface ships to catch. But U-55 had made a critical error. She'd dived too close. Range 600 yards, the sonar operator called out. Contact still closing. She's going deep, sir. Bayldon did the mathematics in his head. A Type 7 could crash dive at roughly 3 feet per second once her ballast tanks flooded. She'd been at periscope depth 30 seconds ago when they'd spotted her scope wake. That put her at roughly 90 feet now. Maybe 120, still within ramming depth if Walker could reach her before she passed 150 feet. All ahead flank, Bayldon ordered. Helm, come right to 045, collision course. The bridge crew exchanged glances. The chief quartermaster opened his mouth, then closed it. You didn't question the captain during an attack run. Walker's ancient boilers screamed as stokers down in the engineering spaces forced steam pressure to maximums her designers would have considered reckless. Her single propeller shaft, 4 feet of bronze forged in 1918, bit into the North Atlantic at 295 revolutions per minute. The destroyer surged forward, her bow lifting, spray sheeting back across her forward gun mount. 32 knots. 33. Her frames groaned with the strain. Range 300 yards. Contact diving, bearing steady. Bayldon could picture it below. The U-boat commander ordering ballast tanks vented, the submarine's nose dropping into the black water, her deck plates tilting forward as she clawed for depth. Every second she gained was another 3 feet between her hull and Walker's keel. Every second Bayldon lost meant ramming, opportunity slipping away. Depth charge crews, stand down, Bayldon shouted down the voice pipe. Clear the stern deck, all hands forward. Now the crew understood. Men scrambled forward along Walker's pitching deck, abandoning their positions at the depth charge racks. If the impact was hard enough, it would snap Walker's spine and fold her stern under. Better to have every man forward of the collision point. Range 100 yards. Contact bearing 044. Depth estimate 130 feet. Bayldon gripped the bridge rail. Too deep. She was already too deep for a clean hit on the conning tower. But maybe, if the angle was right, if Walker's keel could catch U-55's pressure hull before she reached 200 feet. The mathematics of ramming are brutal and precise. Walker displaced 1,490 tons at full load, and she was making 33 knots, 17 meters per second. That translated to roughly 215,000 joules of kinetic energy focused on the 3-foot width of her bow stem. A Type 7 U-boat's pressure hull was constructed of 18mm steel plate with internal ring frames every 1.2 meters. It was designed to withstand external pressure from seawater, not catastrophic impact from above. Brace for impact! The collision happened at 09:47 hours Greenwich Mean Time. Walker's bow plunged into the sea exactly where U-55's hull had been 8 seconds earlier. For one frozen moment, nothing happened. The destroyer's bow cut through empty water, her momentum carrying her forward into what seemed like a miscalculation. Then her keel struck something solid. The impact ran through Walker's entire frame like a struck bell. Metal screamed, rivets sheared. In the forward mess deck, sailors were thrown from their feet. The ship's bell, mounted above the wheelhouse, rang spontaneously. Bayldon was slammed into the bridge console hard enough to crack 2 ribs. Below the surface, Walker's keel had struck U-55's pressure hull at a 20-degree angle, approximately 15 feet aft of the conning tower. The submarine had been at 147 feet and still diving when 1,190 tons of destroyer drove into her from above. The impact crushed her pressure hull inward across an 8-foot section, buckling ring frames and rupturing the main ballast tank designated Ballast Tank 3. Inside U-55, the lights went out instantly. Men were thrown against bulkheads. The chief engineer, standing near the diesel engines, was killed instantly when a structural frame tore loose and struck him. Seawater began flooding through the ruptured pressure hull at approximately 400 gallons per minute, not fast enough to flood the compartment immediately, but more than enough to doom the submarine. Capitan Lieutenant Eworth, thrown against the periscope housing hard enough to break his collarbone, shouted the only order that mattered: "Surface! Emergency blow! All tanks!" But U-55's high-pressure air system had been damaged in the collision. The valves that should have blown her ballast tanks open were jammed. The submarine, flooding through her ruptured hull, had lost all buoyancy. She began falling stern first into the deep Atlantic, her propellers still spinning uselessly, her crew scrambling in darkness as the deck tilted to 40 degrees. Above, Walker wallowed to a halt. Her bow was buckled downward at a 10-degree angle. Her forward collision bulkhead was holding, but water was flooding her forward paint locker. She was taking on perhaps 50 tons of seawater, enough to trim her bow down, but not enough to sink her. "Contact lost," the sonar operator reported. Then, seconds later, breaking up noises, hull collapse sounds, depth now 250 feet and increasing. U-55 imploded at approximately 850 feet, well beyond her crush depth. The noise of her pressure hull failing carried through the water for miles, a series of sharp reports like artillery fire, then the grinding roar of collapsing compartments. 41 German sailors died in approximately 90 seconds. The U-boat commander, who had considered British destroyers to be training targets, went down with his ship. Bayldon, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, leaned against the bridge rail and watched oil spreading across the surface. Walker had just executed the first successful ramming attack of World War II. She'd done it with a tactic the Admiralty considered obsolete, using a ship classified as barely fit for service. And she'd proven that in anti-submarine warfare, the weapon your enemy doesn't expect is worth more than the weapon they've learned to evade. HMS Walker limped into Greenock Naval Base on December 19th, with her bow caved in and her forward compartments pumped full of concrete emergency patching. The damage assessment was immediate and brutal. 3 forward hull frames cracked, collision bulkhead severely deformed, stem post bent 15 degrees to starboard, keel members displaced. Repair estimate, 6 weeks in dry dock, assuming replacement steel plate could be sourced. But it was the intelligence value of Walker's attack that electrified the Admiralty. Captain George Creasy, director of the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division, arrived at Greenock within 48 hours to personally debrief Bayldon. What emerged from those interviews would fundamentally reshape British anti-submarine doctrine for the remainder of 1940. The critical insight wasn't that ramming worked. That had been known in World War I. The revelation was that modern U-boats were vulnerable to ramming in ways their commanders hadn't anticipated. Analysis of U-55's final position, reconstructed from sonar records and the debris field, showed that the submarine had been attempting a standard deep evasion maneuver. She dived at maximum rate to 420 feet, believing herself safe from depth charges set to detonate at 150 feet. What German tactical doctrine hadn't accounted for was the sheer kinetic energy of a surface vessel traveling at 33 knots. Walker's keel had functioned as a 1,500-ton hammer blow delivered at precisely the depth where U-boat pressure hulls transitioned from the reinforced conning tower section to the lighter mid-hull plating. Metallurgical analysis conducted on recovered fragments of U-55's hull plating showed catastrophic structural failure consistent with impact loading far exceeding design specifications. The ring frames, designed to withstand uniform external pressure, had buckled when struck from a single direction. As one Admiralty engineer noted in his report, the U-boat pressure hull is optimized against sea pressure acting equally from all directions. It has no more resistance to impact from above than a tin can struck with a boot. Commander Donald McIntyre, reading the tactical bulletins that emerged from Walker's engagement, immediately recognized the implications. We'd been fighting submarines with weapons they expected, depth charges following predictable patterns. Ramming attacks weren't in the German tactical manual because they assumed we'd abandoned the tactic. That assumption was their weakness. The Admiralty issued Tactical Bulletin CB 45140 in January 1940, distributed to all escort group commanders. The bulletin was classified secret, and its recommendations were stark. When engaging a diving submarine at ranges less than 500 yards, destroyer commanders were authorized to ram at full speed if sonar contact remained solid. The bulletin included specific guidance on collision angles, optimal impact speeds, 30 to 34 knots, and damage control procedures for the attacking vessel. Most critically, the bulletin emphasized the psychological effect. U-boat commanders have been trained to believe that submerging to 400 feet renders them immune to destroyer attack. Ramming attacks executed at close range eliminate this sanctuary and force enemy submarines to remain shallow or evade at ranges where depth charge attacks become effective. The doctrine shift was immediate. Between January and June 1940, British destroyers executed 14 ramming attacks against suspected U-boat contacts. 4 resulted in confirmed kills. 3 resulted in damage forcing U-boats to abort their patrols. The remaining 7 were judged probable hits with possible damage. More importantly, the mere threat of ramming forced changes in German submarine tactics. U-boat commanders began evading at shallower depths, 120 to 150 feet, where they were more vulnerable to depth charges. The average time U-boats spent submerged after detection increased from 45 minutes to over 2 hours as commanders became more cautious about surfacing too soon. German patrol reports from early 1940 show increasing references to aggressive British destroyer tactics and recommendations to evade at longer ranges. The Obsolete Relic had taught the modern Navy a lesson the modern Navy had forgotten. Sometimes the Oldest tactics work precisely because your enemy has convinced himself they no longer matter. Lieutenant Commander Edward Bayldon was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for the U-55 engagement. HMS Walker returned to service in February 1940 with a reinforced bow structure and continued convoy escort duties until 1943. She survived depth charge attacks, collisions with merchant vessels, and a near miss from a German bomber off Iceland. She was finally scrapped in 1946, having escorted 347 convoys across the Atlantic without loss to her own crew. The immediate tactical results of Walker's ramming attack were measurable in numbers that mattered. In December 1939, before the U-55 sinking, German submarines achieved a kill ratio of 7.3 merchant ships per U-boat lost. By March 1940, after ramming tactics had been incorporated into escort group doctrine, that ratio had dropped to 4.2 merchant ships per U-boat lost. British destroyers went from averaging 42 depth charge attacks per U-boat kill to averaging 27 attacks per kill. The difference represented hundreds of merchant sailors who lived instead of dying in burning oil slicks. U-boat losses increased correspondingly. January through June 1940 saw 15 German submarines sunk or severely damaged, compared to 8 in the previous 6 months. 4 of those losses were directly attributed to ramming attacks. Another 3 were attributed to depth charge attacks that succeeded because the U-boat had evaded at shallow depth to avoid ramming attempts. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Ewerth went down with U-55. He was 27 years old and had been married 6 months. His widow received notification in January 1940 that her husband's submarine was missing and presumed lost in the Atlantic. The truth that U-55 had been crushed by a destroyer built before Klaus Ewerth was born was withheld from German casualty notifications. The Kriegsmarine didn't want families knowing their submarines were vulnerable to what amounted to collision tactics. The ramming doctrine influenced destroyer design for the remainder of the war. The Hunt-class escort destroyers, entering service in 1940, were built with reinforced bow structures specifically designed to withstand collision impacts. American destroyer escorts entering British service under Lend-Lease incorporated similar reinforcements. Post-war analysis estimated that ram-capable bows added approximately $8,000 to destroyer construction costs, but saved an estimated 200,000 tons of merchant shipping in 1940 to 41 alone. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was harder to quantify, but no less real. German patrol reports increasingly referenced collision risk as a factor in tactical decisions. By mid-1940, Kriegsmarine tactical manuals had been updated to include specific guidance on avoiding ramming attacks, including recommendations to evade at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards and to surface immediately after detecting close, destroyer contacts rather than diving deep. The irony wasn't lost on British naval historians. Admiral Sir Percy Noble, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, noted in his 1946 memoir, "We spent millions developing ahead-throwing weapons, improved sonar, coordinated escort tactics, all valuable innovations. But in December 1939, we found ourselves winning submarine engagements with the same tactic Nelson might have used, ramming the enemy before he could bring his weapons to bear." HMS Walker's engagement with U-55 remained classified until 1958, buried in Admiralty records alongside thousands of other convoy actions. When the files were finally declassified, naval historians recognized it as a pivot point, the moment when Britain realized that winning the Battle of the Atlantic wouldn't come from superior technology alone, but from willingness to use every weapon available, including the ones everyone had written off as obsolete. There's a dangerous comfort in technological superiority. The Kriegsmarine had built submarines that could dive deeper, run faster, and strike harder than anything their enemies possessed. They'd trained their commanders in modern tactics, installed cutting-edge sonar, and developed doctrine that accounted for every contemporary threat. What they forgot was that warfare isn't won by the side with the newest weapons, but by the side willing to employ every weapon, including the ones the enemy stopped preparing for. HMS Walker was obsolete by every metric that mattered in 1939. Her engines were ancient. Her weapons were inadequate. Her hull was a relic from a war fought before most of her crew were born. But obsolescence is contextual. What's obsolete when your enemy expects it becomes innovative when they've forgotten to defend against it. The lesson extends beyond destroyer tactics and submarine warfare. In any conflict, military, technological, competitive, the moment you write off an entire category of options as outdated is the moment you create a blind spot your opponent can exploit. The Germans built submarines that could survive depth charges at 400 feet. They never thought to reinforce against surface collision at 150 feet because no modern navy would be reckless enough to ram. December 17, 1939, a World War I destroyer, a crew willing to use the oldest weapon in the naval arsenal, and a U-boat commander who learned too late that the past isn't always finished teaching lessons. Sometimes the relic wins. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from the Battle of the Atlantic that deserve to be remembered. Desperate engagements where obsolete ships and determined crews held the line against a technologically superior enemy. And I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.